Welcome to another edition of the Last Negroes at Harvard podcast. I'm Kent Garrett. There were 18 of us in the Harvard College class of 1963. We are all over 83 years old now, and for the last 5 years we have produced a weekly podcast. Today our guest is Gayle. He is an associate professor in the School of Journalism at Northeastern University with a joint appointment in Africana Studies. He is an award-winning journalist who writes about the history of race and identity. His new book is titled Black Moses, a Saga of Ambition and the Fight for a Black State. I'm joined by 17 of my Harvard classmates. And let's start with Alden.
Alden Briscoe, class of 63, born in Mass General, grew up in northwestern Connecticut, lived in various places around the country, and now just south of San Francisco. And my wife and I have a fundraising consulting firm. We work with nonprofits.
Okay, William.
Bill Collins. I'm in Aiken, South Carolina, class of 63, like the rest of these guys. Grew up in Boston, joined the Navy, 20 years in the Navy, various ships, and then worked for Westinghouse for a little while, and then came to Aiken to work at the Savannah River site. I'm now retired from paying work and doing various kinds of volunteer work.
Okay, David Othmer.
Born in Medford, Massachusetts, but grew up in South America and Central America and have lived abroad for early in my career in the Philippines, but live in Philadelphia now, and we've been here for 40 years.
All righty, and Doug.
Doug Shapiro, retired physician, behavioral ecologist. I spent about 15 years studying the behavior of sex-changing coral reef fish, which took me around the world to all kinds of beautiful coral reefs, which unfortunately now a lot of them are bleaching out. And I currently live in Louisville.
Okay. And before we get to John Woodford, don't we have a little singing to do?
Yes.
Oh, is today his birthday, maybe?
Today, I think, is his birthday.
Really?
It is.
Oh, all right, John.
84, man, huh?
All right, so here we go. Happy birthday
to you.
Happy birthday
to you.
Happy
birthday,
dear Woodford.
Happy birthday to you. How old are you today?
Thank you very much. You can guess how old I am. I'm not one of the young guys. Only
92.
Yeah. Big 84.
All right, well, John, tell us who you are.
Well, here I am in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I grew up on Lake Michigan across from Chicago in a quite little town. And I've been in journalism ranging from Muhammad Speaks newspaper to New York Times, but spent most of my time at University of Michigan putting out my own kind of university publication for a while. And that's it.
Nick.
I'm not as young as John is, but born in August. Anyway, live outside Boston. These guys, classmates, and Harvard Business School, India in the Peace Corps for a couple of years, and then back to Boston and investments and so on and so forth. I did spend 2 summers out in Southwest around Gallup, New Mexico, and we had a chance to live for the summers with a couple of Navajo families. So I'm interested in thinking. I haven't read your book, but I get the feeling that there's something in there about Native Americans and Black people coming and working together.
Okay, Hamp.
Powell, Harvard 63. I'm going to compete with you, Alden, and say that I was born in Roosevelt Hospital in New York City. From New York and Boston, and I moved from there into Roxbury and and then Puerto Rico and Dallas, where I got fired from a rich kid's private school. uh, and I've been in Nashville, where I'm a clinical psychologist for the last 40 years.
Okay, the other John Eric Wright.
Hi, I'm John Ehrenreich. I was born and grew up in Philadelphia, and since college, have been living more or less in the New York area. Currently in Western Connecticut, not far from Kent. Um, and I'm a psychologist by training. Before that, a biologist. And in recent years and throughout my life, I've been writing on health policy issues.
Okay, Fred Gardner.
Uh, I'm from Brooklyn before gentrification, and after college, I went to work for Scientific American. I wound up in what we used to call the 6 month program, the reserves where you give them 6 weeks. See, it was before Vietnam heated up. I wasn't trying to dodge that. It was a misunderstanding with my employer about whether the job was draft exempt. Anyway, I was had an interesting time in the Army, and I got the idea to start anti-war coffee houses near bases, and then the crowd that wound up developing that project had a different attitude than me, and I wound up splitting with the left. And I'll make a long story short, I now live in the wine country in Northern California, and I don't like it.
Right. David Allen.
David Allen grew up on a farm in southern Indiana, across from where Doug lives right now in Louisville. Uh, had a varied life, I think would be the right description. Uh, Business and government and academics. And these last years, now that we're all the same age, John left out at 84. Uh, No, the T-shirt also is something I'm proud of. Was an infantry officer in those Vietnam years. No, the focus now is on democracy, and can we keep it? We'll see.
Okay, and Marcy.
I run a nonprofit in New York City. I grew up in Buffalo, and Freddie Gardner, as he was then called, took me and Sue Schwartz to to hear Malcolm X 2 weeks before he was shot. We had to stand at the back.
Wow. Jeff.
Hi, Jeff Fox, born in Chicago. My first job after Harvard 63 was in Venezuela, Caracas, and that set me off on a career as a sociologist, specializing mostly in Latin America, teaching and writing. But more recently, I've been writing fiction, and I'm now living in southern Spain.
Okay, Liz.
Hi, I'm Liz Morey, and since we're all talking about hospitals and where we were born, I was born in Queen of Angels Hospital, Los Angeles, California. Managed to stay in LA until I went to Radcliffe, and that was quite the culture shock. Subsequently got a degree in clinical psychology, and I've been a clinical psychologist doing various things over the course of my lifetime. Moved back to Fresno, California for many years, and have been in Tacoma Park, Maryland for the last 20, because I have two children who in 2022 both retired from the Foreign Service. Um, so, and have three grandkids.
All righty. Okay, Talib, welcome. Thank you for joining us, and tell us a little bit about your life in the book.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me and for all of you joining me virtually. It means a great deal. I've been on a bit of a blitzkrieg of interviews and tour stops and stuff, and so this is one of the more delightful ones. And so I appreciate you for being here. I guess the best way to kind of introduce myself and probably introduce the book is to kind of tell you about the instance about at this point nearly 30 years ago, my parents who are Jamaican, born in Jamaica, raised in Jamaica, moved into the States when they were teenagers, decided what seemed to me as a kid out of the blue to uproot us from everything that we had known in New York, right? Specifically the Bronx and Brooklyn, where I was pretty convinced that all Black people were of Caribbean descent because I was just around more Caribbean people, right? My grandparents, my aunts, uncles, all of their friends, all of their friends of friends were all likewise um, people of Caribbean descent. And they announced to me, because my parents are old school Pentecostal Jamaican folks, that we would be moving to Oklahoma. And there was some like inkling that I had that we would be moving in part because we were visiting parts of Connecticut, we were visiting parts of Westchester County, we were visiting parts of Jersey. So I didn't know much about American geography at the time, but I knew that Oklahoma was far from any of the places we had visited until then. And so I had no preconceived notions aside from the fact that it was away, far away. And so then when we get there, we land. And those of you on this call probably remember the days of people like Oral Roberts advertising to get money to build this university. Well, the first thing I kind of see when we're landing is his prayer tower that's designed in this futuristic Googie space style, the praying hands. And I distinctly remember thinking to myself, well, this is something I've never seen quite before. But as we get to the apartment, it dawns on my parents, who I had thought up until then were quite methodical and deliberate people, that we need things to put in this apartment because we have two kids, and we need a place for them to sleep. We need places for us to sit. We need a desk from which to work. All of those things. Um, and I distinctly remember that we were told to go to this fantastical place that I had yet to hear of until this point called Walmart. And there weren't too many of those in the middle of the Bronx or Brooklyn where I had spent my time before. But I distinctly remember we went to one on the north side of town. And if you know anything about Tulsa, Oklahoma, Tulsa's kind of broken up into these kind of quadrants with Midtown in the center. It almost looks like a cross. And on the southern portion, where we initially landed, was kind of South Tulsa. It was predominantly white, middle to middle upper class. The east was at that point fairly lower income, white population with an increasing number of Hispanic uh, people. On the west was incredibly lower income. In the center, midtown, and downtown was kind of old oil money. And then to the north was and still is the kind of the highest concentration of Black people in all of Oklahoma. It was home to former Black Wall Street, or as what would be called as Greenwood. And just north of Greenwood was this Walmart that we went to. And I didn't know anything about Walmart. I kind of assumed that it would be maybe some sort of grocery store. I didn't realize that they would sell everything from groceries to rifles to furniture to clothes to everything in between. But as we were driving up, there was next to us this Black family. And they were not in a car like we were, right? And they weren't in a train because Tulsa doesn't have those, and they weren't in a bus. Our public transportation system doesn't really exist much in Tulsa like it did in New York. They were all on horseback. I thought to myself, this is different. Um, and what was even more interesting is that once we got to that Walmart and we were parking, this family, of course, they're on horseback, right? So they can't go as fast as we could in our car. They all get there and there's a bar waiting for them, essentially, waiting for other people who ride horses. They tie up their horses. They go into the Walmart. They come back out of the Walmart and they have bags of groceries and other items, and then they ride off again. And I thought perhaps like the most interesting thing wasn't just that these families were on horseback or that they were black, or that it was, a relatively modern era and people were still doing this. It appeared to me very odd that like this Walmart expected them because they had the bar there, right, to tie their horses up on. Um,
Hitching post.
Hitching post, correct. And it then became clear to me that this place that I had landed in, Oklahoma, had a far more unique and strange story to tell about what it meant to live and belong in America than I perhaps had known up until that point. Um, so I grew up in Oklahoma as a way of introduction. I grew up in Oklahoma, went to the University of Oklahoma for undergrad, started to work a lot in economic development, specifically internationally, spent a lot of time in Latin America. Jeffrey, don't ask me to speak anything in Spanish. It's all gone by now. It's been 20 years. And then spent quite a bit of time in the UK doing my graduate work at Oxford, and then did additional graduate work at Harvard after working in consulting and finance and stuff like that, but had always retained this interest in writing. And as much as I wanted, upon getting to Oklahoma, wanted to leave Oklahoma, like every other young person who lives in Oklahoma, you're just like dying to leave, right? Usually to just get to Dallas or Houston, like that was like the mecca for us at that time. Was just can we get a few hours south by driving to a place where things stay open past 8 p.m. I always found myself as a journalist, where I now work at the New York Times Magazine and also teach journalism as well as history and English and other things like that at Northeastern University, I always found myself being pulled back to Oklahoma to this place that kind of is part of flyover country, right? Ostensibly, places that are bypassed and looked over as places that perhaps might hold within them these very iconic and quintessential American stories if they could be told, if they could be rendered in a way that was narratively gripping. And I say that in part because what I learned, yes, through the writing of this story about a guy named Edward McCabe, this kind of northeastern well-to-do black kid who was born 15 years before the end of the Civil War and would go on to be educated at various boarding schools throughout New England and then would work as a clerk on Wall Street and then would work as a clerk towards the 1870s for people like Potter Palmer and Marshall Field. Um, and most of you probably do remember Marshall Field, I would imagine, the department store that while he would do all of those things, he would then go on to try and found his own towns in places like Kansas, in the wake of Reconstruction's failure. And he would attract thousands of Black people to places like Kansas, and he would emerge as kind of a political powerhouse, becoming the first Black statewide elected official post-Reconstruction, especially in the American West. He becomes a state auditor for multiple terms. He presides over the budget processes of a state that's growing radically. But upon losing his third term's reelection, he ends up deciding to embark on something that was relatively, it's wild now, it was probably wilder then, but the idea was, can I create my own black state? Could I get Benjamin Harrison at that time to give me the keys to the six counties that made up what is considered the unassigned lands or Oklahoma Territory? And he doesn't label it something banal or kind, even, right? He, in fact, as Audre Lorde would probably put it, uses the master's tools. He calls it the Negro colonization scheme of Oklahoma.
Mm.
So he's not he's utilizing terms that today would probably get him canceled. And it's usually those sorts of polarizing, somewhat narcissistic individuals that I find myself attracted to, because they feel so iconically American, right? Like what other characters do we think about, right? Whether it's Kit Carson or a host of others who decide to venture into the West and decide to make it theirs. But the reality is that in creating a Negro colonization scheme of Oklahoma, he was also dooming himself to collide with the dreams of so many others. So, as Mr. Bancroft mentioned earlier, there were and still are a lot of indigenous nations, what we used to call them the five civilized tribes, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, the Creek, and the Cherokee, who had been forcibly removed to that area. And in the years before McCabe started off on his adventure in the 1880s and tried to convince Benjamin Harrison to let him run this new black state, many of them were kicked out, right? Over 1.8 million acres were emptied out of these indigenous nations who were remanded there decades before, who were still justifiably and still are justifiably upset, angry, righteously indignant about the atrocities committed upon them. Likewise, also were a lot of poor white laborers who thought to themselves that Reconstruction didn't offer much to me whatsoever. They had a lot of animosity that was fueled oftentimes in the press during the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. Um, that were going to Oklahoma and heeding the call when those unassigned lands were open, that this land would be free and fair to all, that all you had to do was get there, mark your 40 to 160 acres, stay on it for 5 years, and it would in fact be yours. But yet and still, all that did was also attract a ton of black people, some of whom were just one generation from being enslaved, one generation from being emancipated, who likewise were looking for a place to call their own. So it wasn't as if McCabe was operating in some sort of silo. He was operating in a pretty divisive and moment which was just rife with collisions. And so what you find in the book are is him pitting himself against a lot of different interests, wealthy white interests, poor white interests, Native American interests, a lot of other Black people who were already citizens of some of these indigenous nations, like the Creek and the Cherokee and the Seminole, who were like, who is this rebel rouser Edward McCabe, this never enslaved Black guy who spoke differently, who started his own paper, who essentially lied and said that the Waldorf family gave him $25,000 at that time, in those days, dollars, to start his own university that he would call Langston. Who is this guy that decided to found several all black towns? And why is it that he's appointed as this territory's treasurer and auditor? Where does he get off doing this? He has no history here. But perhaps that's the most American thing sometimes that we've done throughout history is we've enabled a lot of people who maybe have had but just a dream to engage in the sort of boosterism that has found different portions of the place that we now call home. So it was for me, yes, this Oklahoma had this gravitational pull, this historical gravitational pull for me that I just couldn't find myself pulling away from. And in some important sense, though I don't show up in the book's pages, I felt myself represented in part because likewise, my family came to Oklahoma nearly 30 years ago with the goal of trying to find out where could we belong. So I don't want to blather on too much. Wanted to give just a quick summation of what the book is about and a bit of an introduction of who I am. But I think perhaps the best way to understand this place, or at least the point which I felt as if the book started being written, even though it formally took me 5 years to write and research and report and thousands of miles logged and driven and more time in archives, catching allergies or having allergic reactions to all the dust. Um, which was perfect timing, Mr. Howell. I did that for about 5 years in various archives, coughing and hacking up a lung. But the I felt as if the process for really understanding this part of the country, which in many cases, in my opinion, is much more of a microcosm of what happens in our country at large, started when my family decided to move to Oklahoma, and I saw a black family on horseback pulling into this magical place called Walmart. That's when I felt as if I started to write that story. So I'll stop there, and I appreciate you for all your time and look forward to all the questions.
John.
Yeah, when I first started in journalism, I worked for Ebony and Jet.
Mm.
And Ebony, one of the first stories I remember seeing was on the town of Guthrie, Oklahoma.
Oh yeah.
And they used to go there, right? This was a black town in Oklahoma. And I think it was, I think it faded. Did it fade away completely? Or what happened to Guthrie? It was a story of decline,
Hmm.
of hope and decline in Oklahoma. And I think it had to do there was also the blacks in the Creeks
Hmm.
and their history also. But did that town wither away? And Langston too. I think was Langston Hughes was maybe named after Langston. That was a big name back then.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that question. So just about 15 minutes driving outside of Oklahoma City, which is our state's capital, you can get to this place called Guthrie, which was historically the territory capital. And there's this in the book towards the last third of the book, you see this fight between the actual people who would end up launching the Oklahoma kind of chapters, plural, of the KKK, and people like McCabe on where the territorial capital, the eventual state capital would be before Oklahoma became a state. And so Guthrie was high density black community, a lot of more progressive interests beyond black people, a lot of white people, a lot of white labor. And Oklahoma City was positioned as this better capital because it didn't have this, as W.T. Brady would then put it, the stench of poor whites, blacks, and Indians, as he put it, right? So that's what initially was the initial death blow, right, to a place called Guthrie. And just outside of Guthrie is this town called Langston, which was the first town that Edward McCabe had founded. It was named after actually John Mercer Langston, who was a Reconstruction era politician. He was the dean of Howard Law School. He was kind of a great and noted Reconstruction era Black thinker. So that's who it was named after. And one of McCabe's both greatest, my book's kind of main characters, famous best bud, but then also at times enemy, was John Marshall Langston's brother, Charles Langston, who McCabe found to be too vested in just purely black interest, as he would put it, and not in the larger project of fighting the Republican Party, because he was a part of the Republican Party. There was large and huge clashes. The decline of some of these towns really starts at the point at which Oklahoma is admitted to the Union. It changes. There's a huge and in some cases very bloody fight to move the capital from Guthrie to Oklahoma City. And in so doing, those towns start their decline pretty there soon thereafter, right? The major roads, commerce, train depots start to deviate from those areas and switch to Oklahoma City and other places. But that's kind of the story of this rapid decline that then takes place over the course of about 50 years. But Guthrie still is there. Langston is there perhaps but by the grace of God. And what helps it sustain itself is that it's also home to that university that McCabe essentially lied and said he got the Waldorfs to help him finance, called Langston University, which is today the furthest west historically black college university in the country. And so that's part of it. That and this kind of noted agricultural and veterinary sciences program is what actually keeps that town such that it is alive.
Hmm.
Uh, how did he found that university if he didn't really have that financial backing that he claimed?
Yeah, great question. So part of it is McCabe's philosophy that I think is, I mean, for those of you who are literary scholars, like if you kind of follow the trail of vernacular history, there's a lot of boasting about what is to come. I mean, even the founding of much of the American West are boosters saying, "Oh, like I got the green light for this thing." Like there wasn't social media, there was no way to verify these claims. And if you were desperate enough, right, if you are living in kind of the burning embers of Reconstruction, right, in the American South, you're gonna leave and you're gonna follow, right? All it is a train ride. And he was in some cases getting train operators to subsidize the cost to bring black workers to the West. So in many cases, like there were some really established black people who did make their way to places like Langston, and so in some cases initially it was private funding that really kept it afloat, but then it essentially, even now, kind of sits under the leadership of the Regents of Oklahoma State University. So it gets a lot of funding also from the state. It's more precarious these days as as goes the case for many public HBCUs, publicly funded HBCUs. But back then, I mean, it was started with, how many HBCUs were founded, right? Spelman was founded in the basement of a Baptist church. The same goes for Langston, that in many cases it was a hodgepodge of incredibly committed, courageous Black folks that long after Langston was founded in 1897, that's when places like Langston actually emerged because they thought to themselves, hopefully we can kind of craft Langston as a bit of a Black metropolis. And what is a metropolis without some semblance of some sort of higher education institution? And so it was really kind of put together by a collection of people and institutions, even without the money, right? Like even without the $25,000 check that McCabe supposedly had gotten, which he didn't. That still came together because they were there and they needed it, right? Um, it was much more a function of urgency and need that put a lot of HBCUs together long before anyone had written anyone else a
Mark,
check.
comma.
What about the book title?
Hmm.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, so and I see David's hand as well. So really quickly, I've told my wife whenever we have kids that she gets full naming rights because I can't name anything. I'm very terrible at it. Um, so I yanked this from what people would call McCabe, right? So McCabe was known. There's a industrious reporter from Milwaukee who traveled to Oklahoma during the land run, which is usually, it was a pretty violent affair. The book kind of starts with McCabe being shot and a lot of people actually dying in pretty violent and gruesome ways during the second land run. And he said that, McCabe would be the one who would be Moses. Now, that was a very laudatory one. There were a lot of other people, Black, white, and otherwise, who would call McCabe Moses or Black Moses in a very mocking way, right? Because Moses, for those of you who remember that portion of Sunday school, Moses saw the promised land, but he never actually stepped foot in it, right? Died before he'd even get there. So to some extent, it was a mocking term. But what we see in kind of the vernacular history of people like McCabe is that they then would take on the accusatory or antagonistic titles that people would give them and then would say, sure, yeah, fine. You want to call me Black Moses? Initially, the book was called Push Ahead because that was a pretty common way of talking about Black people or women or poor people who thought of themselves capable of doing more than society had said they could do. And so one of the other nicknames he had was Push Ahead because he pushed ahead of his station. But again, that was a term that he said, sure, fine, I'm a push ahead, right? And so to some extent, I enjoyed him because he kind of enjoyed dealing with the antagonisms, right? I almost imagine that if he was here today, he would be a very fun person to see going back and forth on the evening news, right? Because he was pugnacious and enjoyed a good bit of ribbing. And so I stuck on Black Moses because it was a motif that people were familiar with and because from the late 1870s through the early 1880s, there was a mass migration of Black people suddenly, kind of in a sudden way, during the end of as Reconstruction was faltering, out of the South into the American West, specifically Kansas, and they were known as the Exodusters. And so that exodus seemed to then also line up with this title that McCabe was being given, but that he also took on as this Black Moses. But
Okay.
I also see David's hand. I didn't want to
David,
neglect
go
that.
ahead.
Um, Gee, where do I jump in? Um, I I was initially spurred because I wanted to find out why did McCabe feel it necessary to lie about the check? I, but let me step ahead beyond that, if I might.
Sure.
You'd mentioned that, of course, your family were Pentecostal and they
Uh-huh.
had you flying into, forgot his name now, but where
Oral Roberts. Yeah.
Oral Roberts, yes, yes. And I have to say, my mother gave a lot of money to Oral Roberts, so
Yeah.
am I forgetting it? Probably is Freudian. Um, more than curious, after we deal with the $25,000 fake check, um, where did that go for you and the family? Well,
Where did what go for me and the family? I'm sorry.
uh, were you Pentecostal? Are you Pentecostal?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, happy to answer that. Happy
And
to answer that.
how that figured in the years as you grew up there. But
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, so my family is deeply Pentecostal and very strict. I didn't see a movie until I was about in theater until I was about 14 years old. And I had to convince my parents by writing an essay about why that would be okay. So very, very strict Pentecostal background. And I can quote the Bibles. I can name the books of the Bible backwards, probably in a couple other languages. So so I think like it informs a great deal about my like literary practice in that like even with the writing of this book, like I wanted there to be kind of that crescendo. So I wasn't necessarily just adherent to kind of I mean, the book does have like a tragedy element to it, right? Yeah, it's rollicking. Yes, it has like the Western themes going, but like I didn't want it to be a simple Greek tragedy. I wanted there to be, and I saw from the reporting and the research that there would be kind of these um, opportunities for crescendo intermittently, right? Even if you've ever attended like especially a Black Pentecostal sort of church experience, there is this rise, this fall, but then there are these smaller ebbs and flows to grab the reader in. And the last thing I would say is that oftentimes preachers are kind of labeled that the worst thing you can hear as a writer is that you're being very preachy. Um, but I usually say that's because like most people haven't been or heard like my grandfather or other Black preachers go in, right, to preach because their stories are kind of hewed together by just pure narrative, right? And they're not preaching or being hyper didactic about the ways in which the main points are delivered, but that it's so suffuse, it's so integrated into the narrative that all you can do is come away with a sense of perhaps how I was feeling. And I think what you'll notice is that I felt like this is an important story to tell, and that a lot of these kind of iconic American hero tales are in many cases fueled by braggadocio, right? The $25,000 check that feels much more tied to myth than it does reality. But perhaps that's part of this larger tale, right? Of how a lot of the American West, as I saw it, came to be. I just thought it'd be really interesting to follow someone who is often overlooked by history. This Black guy who wanted to create his own state and failed drastically. Just FYI, for those of you who might not have caught on, Oklahoma is not a Black state. It is not that. But I thought perhaps it'd be really interesting to not just allow the history to be told by the winners, but by someone who lost and lost in tragic and drastic fashion.
Mhm, mhm.
notice, incidentally, that from Oklahoma come one of the voices of what are called heterodox economics. Now, this is not on the lines that we're discussing today, and yet to be found for heterodox economics speaks to people who are are careful about saying what it is they care about,
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
things that the rest of the world does not accept.
yeah.
Interesting.
Nick, Nick.
Uh, could you sort of expand a little bit on uh, the relationship between McCabe and Native Americans
Sure.
time,
He was not loved.
politically, socially?
Yeah, he was not adored is the most succinct way of putting it. The reality is, though, as I wrote in my first book, which really does focus a great deal on the Muskogee Creek Nation and the Cherokee Nation, and specifically the Black people who, in many cases, were leaders of it, right? So at the time that McCabe is doing all of this, right? Oklahoma is hurtling towards becoming part of the Union, right? So I think this context might be important for you, Mr. Bancroft. So Oklahoma is hurtling towards becoming part of the Union. There are a variety of factions, both kind of within some of these indigenous nations, but then at the same time within the Black community, well, at the same time within the white community. And what becomes clear is that everyone is clear that there's an option for something to happen, either the unification of what we consider Indian territory, more to the eastern portion of Oklahoma, and Oklahoma territory, right, which is to the western portion, that they would be combined, or that there would be some kind of cutting up of these territories to create a variety of different states. So at the same time, right, people like Alex Posey and Pleasant Porter from the Muskogee Creek Nation and Samuel B. Hayes are crafting things like the Sequoia Constitution to create the Sequoia state, which would be a state that would contain essentially only people who were citizens of these indigenous nations. They would appoint their own governor, or elect their own governor. They would appoint their own senators and congresspersons. Um, that's happening. At the same exact time, a lot of white leaders like Bill Alfalfa, Alfalfa Bill, are one of our kind of considered one of the fathers of Oklahoma and our first governor, is inserting himself into the Sequoia Nation and explicitly ensuring that Black people weren't allowed to participate. Now, just a couple of years before that, right? We have to keep a couple of things in mind, right? So one, during the Trail of Tears and Indian removal, it's estimated that anywhere between 15 to 30% of the people who were traveling with them were people of African descent, who were either enslaved or adopted in fully or citizens of that nation, of those, whatever nation it might have been, Creek, Seminole, Choctaw, what have you. Additionally, just years before this Sequoia Nation was there, and during the time that McCabe is actively organizing, the very people who are helping to convene the Sequoia National Convention are the very people who also were maligning their own principal chief, a guy named Legis Pyramid, a guy who was my skin tone, unmistakably Black, who was the chief of the Creek Nation, maligning him, calling him many a racial epithet, primarily for the purposes of trying to to prevent what they saw as the dilution of indigenous identity through the appointment of Black people. So then you can imagine someone like McCabe then inviting thousands of people, right? Thousands of Black people to come into the place that you've already had to see go from many, many millions of acres to far less millions of acres. And eventually it was hurtling towards becoming one unified territory, effectively like no acres that are exclusively for your use. So if with that kind of context, McCabe then enters the scene, of course you wouldn't be liked, right? You're pitching this place as a Black state after so many decades, so many at this point centuries of being harmed actively by the country. So yeah, I think McCabe was not a friend of these indigenous nations, even though in some cases he was being invited to come by Black citizens of these very nations. So it's a really complicated and messy tale, which I think is part of, or if not part of, representative of the messiness of our own kind of American story of identity.
Mm.
Hopefully
Wow.
that's helpful.
John,
Wow.
John Ehrenreich?
Um, Thanks. In my distant memory, Oklahoma during that same period was a center of both populist activity and slightly later Socialist Party activity.
Big time.
So I wonder how those responded to McCabe and how, what the interactions were.
Yeah, I mean, so some of those very people I just mentioned, like Alex Posey and others, were deeply popular. So to provide a little bit more context that Mr. Ehrenreich is providing us an opportunity to discuss is, you go down to Hugo, Oklahoma, southeastern Oklahoma, or Little Dixie. That was for a long time a significant populist stronghold. I mean, if you weren't interested in strong labor rights reforms and whatnot, like it's just not the place for you. There are some really fascinating episodes of history that I hope someone writes some novels of people being shot at and held up for not, for breaking the proverbial picket line, right? So I think part of that is that, yeah, I think racism is quite a hell of a drug, right? And when you present I think racism and zero-sum politics are quite the powerful set of drugs, quite the combo, right? Because if zero sum, of course, right? If I win, you lose somehow. If you win, I lose somehow, and we're dealing with a finite amount of space, finite amount of opportunity. And instead of kind of our government framing this as an opportunity for thinking creatively about shared prosperity and shared abundance, it was again free and fair for all. So like you divvy it up, right? And on top of that, all the while, the first set of laws that are passed in Oklahoma, right? So if you, what I did was at one point, 'cause I knew what the first law and then subsequent laws were that were passed in Oklahoma when it became a part of the union. So I just looked at all of its neighboring, states, like what the first set, and the first set of laws for these places are like law and order kind of laws, water rights, like very kind of how do we subsist? How do we survive in this new place together? Oklahoma's very first law passed, and this is why I write that Oklahoma, like the rest of America, became the South, was that it was a Jim Crow law. It was to ensure that black people and white people would not exist in the same train cars. And then on top of that, the several laws passed after that are anti-miscegenation laws, which of course were excluded when it came to white and indigenous peoples could intermarry, right? In many cases, as those who watched or read Killers of the Flower Moon, it was so that many wealthier white actors could get access to a lot of the land and eventually oil headship rights that a lot of Native American folks had, right? So it was like that became such a poison that separated. Now, if you would imagine all of these poor people flooding into Oklahoma that were already in Oklahoma, be they indigenous, black, white, what have you, imagine what sort of kind of political frame that would be to have those individuals not fighting for the scant resources that were left over for them, but rather thinking creatively about what could be achieved together. And then once you kind of start to think that way, you start to feel a little differently, or at least you start to feel how historically informed our current moment is, right? Um, and so to some extent, it's a bit of a lament. It's an elegy, right? Looking back at Oklahoma's history because it was such a hotbed for decades after my book's period is written. For decades, this is a hotbed of really powerful, interesting populist politics, really strong and creative thinking when it came to labor movements, the Wobbly movement, and others. But sadly, we see zero-sum politics from the start of this state's young journey really poisoning the well, right? And really poisoning our politics such that it's no surprise that Oklahoma and much of the United States looks the way that it looks when it comes to discussions of politics and polarization. Hope that was helpful.
Mhm. Doug.
Yeah, I would like to ask you a very different sort of question.
Please.
If I remember correctly, you spent some time at Oxford University.
I did.
I spent 6 years doing a PhD at Cambridge University
Oh, lovely.
and in the zoology department. The man who ran the undergraduate lab training system in that department was this brilliant guy who knew all kinds of stuff. He was every bit as knowledgeable as all the professors who were teaching in the department and so forth. And yet, it always astonished me because he seemed to accept his position and
Mm,
never, inspired to do anything greater than that. And this, to me, was a very different kind of attitude from what I was used to growing up in America. So my
hmm.
question for you is, how would you compare the class system in England with the experience of modern day blacks in America?
That is a that is a great dissertation idea. No, I think that because I also have a lot of family who live in the UK as well. And my wife also went to graduate school before she went to med school here in Boston at Harvard. She went to graduate school also at Cambridge, focusing on lots of interesting pharmacology work. And the thing that detested her so much was kind of the entrenchment of the class system. I would say that two things. I would say one, I think when we kind of look within groups, there is a significant amount of rigidity, especially in our cultural practices when it comes to class, right? So, like within the Black community, there is, in many cases, a certain degree of rigidity. So, people like Lawrence Otis Graham, who wrote Our Kind of People, and also wrote a phenomenal biography, kind of a family biography of Blanche Bruce, the very first US Senator elected to a full term from Mississippi during the Reconstruction era. He really talks about some of these kind of how entrenched certain class divisions actually are when you look within, say, the Black community. And so I think that like people used to be able to claim that in America, race determined a great deal, just like class determined a great deal in the UK. My contention would be that the collision of a lot of these different identity factors actually tells us a lot more about our politics than we would like to believe. So, as an example, for instance, Donald Trump made significant inroads with Black and Hispanic men. I mean, massive. Some of the most significant inroads that we've seen a Republican make since Bush, right? And Bush really didn't do well with Black men relative to Trump. He did pretty well with Hispanic folks, but that was primarily because he made certain really intense appeals on the basis of compassionate conservatism, which resonated with a more social gospel orientation of Catholicism that some people might adhere to. So I think that like what we see with Trump in this case is a really interesting kind of inversion of some of our expectations when it comes to race being on one side, class being on the other. But in fact, the kind of the more intensive look at the intertwinement between those two identity factors might help us better understand our current politics because I think for a lot of people we're quite puzzled, right? Whether you're a historian or a political scientist or just someone who's generally interested, there's a lot of befuddlement for why it is that Trump made such significant gains amongst Black men and Hispanic men. And I think that has a lot to do with this intermingling of these identity factors like race and class, and kind of our ongoing kind of assumption that one exists over in one spot and the other exists on the other, and never the twain shall meet.
Hmm. Wow.
Okay. Hemp.
I just wanted to say that I'm jealous. Even though I am a fellow Oklahoman, when I was 2 years old, my
Oh,
father was in training there. That Woodford gets to be John, but I was Mr. Howell and Nick Bancroft was Mr. Bancroft.
Whoa.
How, how do I get to be Hamp to you?
Uh, Jeff.
Oh, yeah, no, I just wanted to hear more. You started on something, but I thought you were about to tell us why you think Trump was so successful in attracting black men.
Yeah, I think we can explain a lot, and I might bring this back to maybe some of my roots, right? Because I know David was asking about my Pentecostal roots and referencing people like Oral Roberts and how his mom gave money, and my mom gave money, and my grandmother gave money, and aunts and uncles who never walked into a church building in their lives can still quote the P.O. box and the zip code that Oral Roberts would end his programs with, right? So let me do it like this, Jeff. I think that at one point, 85 million people around the country were watching Oral Roberts on television. And I'd be hard pressed to say that anyone really remembers much of the content of what he spoke about, right? I I wrote this piece that comes out soon that really kind of walks through kind of the history of the prosperity gospel in America for the New York Review of Books. And I don't, I, growing up in that world, could not tell you what this, I don't know what exactly was Oral Roberts preaching beyond if you believe hard enough and you kind of if you believe hard enough, if you kind of even watch how I've lived my life, perhaps you too, right, can receive this healing, this financial blessing, so on and so forth. So I made the argument that Donald Trump is just the best televangelist, prosperity gospel televangelist we've ever had.
I
And I think that
like
there
that.
has been a priming of that pump for the American century, right? When we look at the history of the 20th century, especially as you leave kind of the early 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, and you enters in people like Norman Vincent Peale and Oral Roberts and others, you see them orienting or trying to, and successfully, at least in the eyes of millions of people, um, articulating this kind of civic religion that if you believe in yourself, like, of course we can see the abundance, the kind of radical growth post World War II, because America has been believing itself. Because America is a little different than the rest of the other. Like that kind of civic religion and the architecting, articulating in very simple terms, is really important. And who was sitting in that pew almost every single Sunday with his father Fred? It was Donald, right? Who was sitting at the feet of Norman Vincent Peale at Marble Collegiate chapel in New York. So I think that part of why he's done so well beyond just the two groups that I mentioned is because he's a really, really good prosperity gospel televangelist. Perhaps the best. I don't. I would challenge anyone today to tell me what like he really believes from a policy or political perspective or even a religious perspective. But I would not be hard pressed if we just sat for together as what the 16 or 20 of us on this call. I'm sure we can all very quickly point out the means, the tactics, the distribution methods whereby he's allowed him as the message and the messenger to be amplified through every kind of media tool we can imagine, right? So to some extent, I think he's the culmination of the American century and the perfect kind of televangelist that we've ever had.
David.
So, sorry that crucial family call interrupted me there,
No
but
problem.
helpful actually, because that means I don't know some of what's gone down here. Now I ask to have it revealed. Um, uh, you pointed out initially that you found McCabe interesting in part because he was this narcissist,
hmm
and you paired up that story with all the others that all the rest of us grew up, Daniel Boone, so forth,
hmm
so on. Um, I, for me, that fits perfectly with this image of televangelism.
Hmm.
Heard I grew up there too. Now where I am now, it's a very different story. But um, I, I also have the strong sense that until we are able to meld together the extreme individualism that we're so proud of on the frontier with an appreciation for folks around us and how we only go forward, human beings, literally, in social groups, how we mix this um, oil and water. Uh, I'm curious where you come out on that. And since we're getting close to the end here, I'm going to finish up with the last one. Hopefully, we can get to both of them. And that's, have you thought about a career in politics?
So the last one I can answer very quickly, which is no. Absolutely not. Not doing it.
Let me be loud and clear.
Yeah. But to your first point, I want to make sure I understand your question. Could you kind of state the question a little?
What I'm doing is contrasting the individualism that we
Sure.
idolize in America.
hmm
And I think you very nicely have brought out a key example of televangelism. I mean, go on the radio where I grew up in Indiana, even today, every 15 minutes there's a new preacher reaching into.
Yep. Yep.
Those are failures essentially compared with Trump as a televangelist, but it's extreme narcissism. I mean, beyond imagine.
Yeah.
The world revolves around me and do things with, but human beings can't operate that way. Don't operate.
Sure.
We can't exist without other people. We don't have language. We don't have
Yeah.
entities of ourselves. And the whole issue, and I think the whole struggle that we're seeing now today being played out is how do we bring these two together? How do we have both individual and the group? That's really as
Yeah.
we're having right now, a group.
Yeah. So I think that, look, I mean, there's been much written from, Bowling Alone to others that the idea that we're in this alone, or that we can accomplish much as a society with a bunch of individuals running in various directions without communing with one another, is part of why things don't look so good anymore. But I do think that, even if you were to ask any one of these televangelists, successful or not, they didn't do it alone. And part of the conceit of the book is that the ambition of this one guy, Edward McCabe, was both fueled. He did not come up with the initial idea to make Oklahoma an all-black state, right? That actually came out of a very powerful scene, which I won't spoil for you, but that happens over 180 miles away from where he was sitting in his state capitol office in Kansas, where a collection of black men and black women decided to get together and discuss this plan and initially form something called the Oklahoma Immigration Association, right? So that the very idea that this could even be a biography of a single man was false. That's why it wasn't called the story of Edward McCabe, right? That in fact it was this saga of ambition that involved so many other people who were likewise invested with just trying to find, like, where can we belong, right? Which I think is such a, at least for me, maybe because I'm the son of immigrants, like it's such a central question that I feel as if I've asked myself personally, like, where do I fit in and where do I belong? But I know we're over the hour, and I know that Bill has his hand up as well. Sorry about that.
But Bill,
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I'm a Catholic Christian, and
Mhm.
I've never understood the prosperity gospel. Jesus Christ was crucified. He had no worldly power, none.
Sure,
And how does that translate into the prosperity gospel? I've never understood that.
sure. I can
I
give
mean,
a very,
I'm interested in my own well-being, of course, and the well-being of my family,
yeah.
not to an extreme degree. And I give away a lot of my stuff and a lot of my time to others. And I've never understood how Jesus Christ crucified translates into the prosperity gospel.
Sure, yeah. I mean, the easiest way to kind of articulate that very succinctly is that it has very little to do with Jesus, right? That's step number one, right? And that it's an overemphasis on, I mean, using a word that's too big for this time of day, but a very eisegetic analysis of the scripture, which is that, look, I'm seeing the world around me, right? Norman Vincent Peale was seeing the world around him, and lots of great things were happening, right? GI Bill was signed, people were going to college at record levels. People were starting to own homes at record levels. The FHA was pumping tons of money into the redevelopment of housing opportunities for people, right? We were a country on the move. And so he was looking at all of that around them and then decided, well, so then where can I cherry pick elements of scripture that then can help to ground this quote unquote evolving civic religion with something that feels a little bit more scriptural and spiritual, right? So it has very little to do with Jesus. I think that's kind of the core element of it. And it has a lot to do with trying to use elements of scripture and throwing darts at the wall to see which one would stick to what was happening as an explanation of this country on the move, because we really were. I mean, we really, really were a country on the move during the 20th century. And the sort of advancements and advances that we had made were extraordinary and almost unimaginable if you were, ending the 19th century, walking into the 20th century. So to some extent, I think that that's what makes it hard to square, because it's not squared. It's cherry picked, cobbled together, and then presented as, oh, okay, well, this is an explanation for why we should double down on this emphasis on material gain. Even though, as you mentioned, right, the person at the center of this Christian story had no worldly possessions, gave it all up, and made what is pitched to us as the ultimate sacrifice, right? And so it runs completely and orthogonal to that narrative, in part because it empties it of the core person at the center of it, right? Jesus Christ.
Wow. Well, Khalid, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you
It's
all.
really been fascinating. And what are you working on next? Just a quick question.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I have the massive book proposal here, but it's the most times when we think about the wealth gap or the racial wealth gap, it's usually done in terms of snapshots, right? We look at a moment in time, but that really doesn't give us much in terms of like how we got here. And so, what would it mean to tell the story of the racial wealth gap in America through one family over the course of about 410 years?
Oh,
And so,
Wow.
for the
interesting.
past couple of years, I've been intensively with this one family, both black and white, that represent and also were at the center of creating economic policy from the colonial period through secession, through even the early 20th century, and how differently those inheritances have played out, and how much that's representative of kind of the larger wealth gap in America.
Wow, that's quite interesting. Great.
I'd just like to
Thank you
say
so
one,
much.
could I say one final word? And
Yeah.
I'd like to make a nod to Nani Burns,
Yeah,
Burns Center, and
definitely.
husband was in our class, Rick Burns. Uh,
Yes.
and so very appreciative of what Nani has done, of course. And you are a terrific representative of what
Thank you.
she wanted.
I appreciate that. That means a lot.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Okay, everybody. Thanks. Okay. Take
Thank
care
Thank
now.
you.
you. Thanks a
Good.
lot.
Thank you
Bye.
all.
Wonderful.
That was Khalid Gayle from Northeastern University. His new book is titled Black Moses, A Saga of Ambition and the Fight for a Black State. And that's it for this edition of the Last Negroes at Harvard podcast. I'm Kent Garrett. I'll talk to you again next week.